Peace be on you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Today we're joined by Brother Hamza. We're going to be talking about why I accepted Islam.
Why did I accept Islam? You know, the funny thing is, there are many conversions that a person has after they accept anything. In my case, it was the beautiful religion of Islam.
And when did you become a Muslim, out of curiosity?
So I became a Muslim in...
I'm just going to interrupt you throughout this entire story, by the way.
That's fantastic. No, that's all right. It was in 2004.
Yeah.
When I first became a Muslim. And I suppose I should tell you.
That's right after 9/11 in New York.
Absolutely, 100%. But you know, the thing is that, of course, 9/11 was a horrific time for all of us living in New York at the time because we were there firsthand.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, at that time, I was working for a bank which was a few blocks away from the World Trade Center over at 55 Water Street. And that night, the night before that, I had gone out with some friends and we came home really late and everything. And so I overslept and I had a 9 a.m. at One World Trade. And
did you?
Yeah, definitely. And so I overslept, and this is back in the days though. So I have to hip you to this because in the 2000s, for all the millennials, they won't know anything about what I'm talking about, right? But this is back in the days when you had an answer machine.
Oh my God.
And when you actually called somebody up, if they didn't pick up while the phone was ringing and it went to the answer machine, they could actually sit there and listen to you. This is where we got the idea of screening the calls.
Okay.
Yeah, this is where that comes from. It means that you was actually just sitting there with a bag of chips, listening to the person like, yeah, what's going on, Tahir? You there? If you there, then pick up. And you pause for a second. All right, so I'm guessing you're not there. You sure? Right? So this is where screening the calls came from. It came from like being able to listen to an answer machine.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
And you decided whether or not you wanted to pick up. So that morning, a friend of mine, he calls me up and he's hollering into my answer machine because I had told him before we split up earlier that, yeah, man, I got a 9 a.m. tomorrow. I got to make sure that I make it and this, that, and the third. So fast forward, he's calling me up. And it woke me up hearing his voice, you know, coming from my answer machine. So I got up, dragged myself over to, yo, what's going on? Oh, thank God you're home. I'm like, well, if you didn't think I was here and I was down at One World Trade, what would be the point of hollering into the answer machine? He says, I didn't think you'd get up. I was like, yeah, that's cool. So he's like, yo, turn on your TV. I'm like, why? What's with the TV? He's like, yo, I can't even explain it to you. Just turn on your TV. So I went over and I turned on the TV, and by that time, the first plane had already hit.
Oh, I see.
So we were just...
And you had a meeting there?
And I had a meeting on the first floor, obviously. Now, where the plane hit was probably like floor 110 or something like that, floor 100, but very high up. So the likelihood, you know, God willing, of me being able to have gotten out, one would imagine, one would hope that I would have been able to get out.
Yeah.
It was just shocking. It was absolutely shocking. You know, it's like a plane. I mean, you can't even begin to absorb that. Anyway.
Did that play a role in you starting to investigate Islam when it came out?
Not at all. And this is the point that I wanted to make, you know, because I get that from time to time whenever people ask me about the role of 9/11 and coinciding with the time that I accepted Islam. There was really no connection for me. For me, you know, these weren't religious people who had done this. These are psychopaths.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you're not going to bump into anyone on the street who's, you know, just going to arbitrarily think, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll hijack a massive plane and fly it into a building. I mean, it takes a real loss of sense to even entertain that for more than a fraction of a second unless you're watching a Hollywood movie. So, I mean, for me, there was no connection whatsoever. It's a matter of timing for people when they look at those things, because my view of Muslims prior to that were that they just fell into the regular bucket of religious people.
Yeah.
You know, if I had any view whatsoever, I mean, being African American, growing up in New York, you knew about the Nation of Islam, if anything.
Yeah.
And they got your attention more so than the Orthodox Muslim community.
Yeah. So
when you think of the Muslims or Islam, you think of like bean pies, bow ties, and you know what I mean, and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's it. So as I got older, you know, in my mid-20s, then I started to appreciate that there were different sects within Islam, and the Orthodox Muslims being, of course, the majority of Muslims. So, in short, one day I was working at a bank and decided to go visit a client that my staff had been talking about. I heard this sort of chatter around the office all day. And it was a group of guys that owned a chain of sandwich stores called Subway. It's like Blimpies, right? And
The Subway.
it's called Subways. So like Blimpies, you go to.
Not the Subway.
I'm sorry. I've got it backwards. It was called Blimpies, which is like Subway.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, so
Right?
you just met the original founders of Subway.
No.
They inspired you to accept Islam.
No, it's a franchise like anything else, whether it's Subway or Blimpies, right?
Okay, fine.
So I'm sorry, I have it backwards.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to equate it for you. It's like Subway, but it's called Blimpies,
Okay,
right?
fine.
So went to go visit these guys for a business deal, and after we had concluded our business, we were just sitting around talking informally, and so I took that opportunity to mention some. One thing I always respected about the Muslims is they seem to be really like properly religious people, and what's really impressive is how you guys are willing to actually give up your lives for your religion. Like I come from a Christian background, we'll preach it on Sunday, but we ain't dying for it on no day, And he says, it's because of our faith. I was like, what is it about your faith? He's like, well, it's our book. God dictated our book. I'm like, oh, you mean it was inspired, like, whoever wrote the book?
Because you had a good biblical background. Your grandmother was
Of course, my
preacher,
grandmother was a Christian missionary
Baptist.
for about 40 years. So I thought it was like that, Obviously, the Bible is rife of stories of people who were inspired by God and they've written one thing or another. And I thought it was like that.
Yeah.
So he's like, no, God dictated it from start to finish, cover to cover. I'm like, man, you got to be kidding me.
So he actually used the word dictated.
Dictated.
Because Muslims often don't. So he made a point of it.
No. He said, I remember he said dictated, word for word. And, dictated has a strong connotation.
Yeah.
You just get this imagery like, say this, say this, say this, say this. And I was really amazed by that. And I was just like, man, this should be the most famous book in the world. He says it is. I said, I'd never heard of it. He said, that's your problem. I said, that's fair. Right? So these guys, and to show you, by the way, that in my mind at least, there was no apparent connection between me conversing with these Muslims and anything that might have happened in regards to 9/11 or whatever. One of the guys' name was Gigi, which was short for jihad.
Really?
And I made no connection whatsoever. It's like, oh, so this is Gigi, and it was like, hey, what's up, Gigi? Gigi, I got it right, yeah. So that's the name your mama gave you? It was like, no, my full name is Jihad. It's like, oh, okay, right on. Nothing, meant nothing to me. It meant no connection, So I was free from the sort of stereotyping or the key wording that happens to the average person. Most people hear Allahu Akbar, jihad, and the first thing they want to do is jump out the window, you know what I mean? But especially at that time, and particularly in New York, there were no such connections. New York is a super diverse place. This was happening in the Bronx, by the way. And in the Bronx, we've just got a melting pot. So you've got an Arab community, you've got an Albanian, Orthodox Jew community, African American, Latino, the list goes on, right? So we started to talk about this sort of informally, and we became friends over time. I would pop by after work and see them at their office, and we would sit down and talk, and they would bring out lamb and rice and tea, and we would just converse like friends. And so one day they said to me, we've got this tape that you might want to check out. You might find it really interesting. Because they could see I was becoming more and more interested, not only in them, but also in the religion. And they weren't super religious people at all, by any stretch, right? But it was just interesting to get an insight into
what
religion.
ethnicity were they?
They were from Yemen.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So for me, it was just interesting getting an insight into the Islamic faith by Muslims themselves. Most people will make a judgment of a thing by people who have little to no connection with that thing.
Yeah, that's
Right.
true.
So for Ahmadi Muslims, people will go and ask people who are against Ahmadi Muslims.
Yeah.
Right. For Christians, people will go to them and ask them about Islam.
Yeah.
So it's odd. So I liked getting that firsthand information.
Yeah.
So anyway, they gave me a tape of a debate between a Christian scholar and a Muslim scholar. And when I got home and I got to the part where the Muslim scholar challenged the Christian scholar on the authenticity of the Bible, I was absolutely shocked to see that the Christian scholar didn't even deny it. And when I looked into this a little bit more, I found that it was quite common knowledge that the Bible had been altered. And amongst the academics, the intelligentsia, this was a common fact.
Yeah.
Right? For me, that had a profound effect on me, though, because as we talked about earlier, my grandmother was a Christian missionary for nearly 40 years. You know, we had grown up with her. She trained us in the Bible, and we traveled with her. And I saw someone who throughout my life was just about as devout as they come. She absolutely believed every bit of it. But she was a rather simple person, you know? And I thought to myself, that's amazing. The average person is being told, probably from the day they're born until the day they die, that this book is rock solid, the Word of God. And then amongst the intelligentsia, amongst the academics, they openly just chuckle, you know, at the well-known fact that it's in fact a collection of books that we don't actually really know who wrote them.
And each book was a collection of parchments split up into hundreds of pieces.
Of course. Of course.
Which vary from translation to translation.
Yep.
You know, year to year. I mean, I know, you know, the King James Bible famously threw out a whole bunch of passages which included rebellion. Because King James didn't want to have anything to do with rebellion in there.
Yeah.
So
for me, it was absolutely fascinating. So this lit my fire in terms of wanting to know more. I wanted to know more. In fact, for me, I needed to know more because I felt a certain sense of righting a wrong, right? So if you have so many generations, and I've told you personally, of course, my family comes from a long tradition of, you know, Baptist ministers, etc., you know, established several churches. And so for me, I'm like... Mega churches. So I'm like, wow, all of these people have been born, lived, and died. And this sort of information is just open and known. So I began to study, and it's funny how it slowly changes you, because prior to that, you know, if any firm church-minded person were to stop me on the street, I'd think of 100 reasons why I need to get to where I'm going, and I need to humbly say, oh, no, excuse me, I don't have the time. They knock on my door, and no, sorry, you know. But right at this time now, whenever anyone stopped me on the street or knocked on my door, the evangelical types, I'd be, yes, come in, have a cup of tea, you know, make yourself comfortable now. Got a couple of questions for you that really been boggling me. And anyway, as I progressed in debating in that part of the Bronx and doing my own studies, the Arabs lovingly gave me this name, Hamza, and this is how I got my name. And so it came to a point where I decided that, okay, I feel like I need more. I need to do more in the sense of what I discovered at that time was earth-shattering for me, right? But the main question that propelled my desire to learn more was this idea that God continued to talk.
Okay.
Right? And God continued...
Where did you learn that idea from?
Well, growing up as a child, my grandmother was a Baptist missionary, as I mentioned, and she was from the old school.
So everything was a revelation.
Everything was a revelation. You know, God told me this morning, and you know, my grandmother would have made a fantastic Muslim. She got up at like 4:30 every morning to pray. You know, and you know, I witnessed, you know, sort of every day growing up with my grandmother and my parents, you know, this sort of living relationship with God vis-a-vis through my grandmother. So that combined with the fact that in the Bible, there's, you know, countless stories of this one or that one to whom God spoke, or God sent an angel to speak.
So you wanted that for yourself. You want to say, look, if this
absolutely.
is true, where is it?
Absolutely. Where is it? Right? I want to talk to God.
The universe has been around for 13 billion years. It's only been a few thousand years between me and those people. So why can't God keep it up?
Well, the thing is, again, my grandmother used to say, oh, God told me last night. So I used to think to myself, she's not a liar. Right? Maybe God did. Right? Who's to say that God didn't? Now, that's a completely subjective area, which is totally fine. But for me at that time growing up, witnessing these things, I thought to myself, for me, that's proof God talks. In the Bible, you have all of these people that God talks or has talked to. And now I've got my grandmother right here. So God definitely still talks. But in reality, you find that so many religions slam the door, right? It's like as if, God forbid, they have in their minds, they've taped over God's mouth so that in their conception of things, God no longer speaks, right? And so I always had a problem with that. That and the fact that I found it just bizarre that a human being could be God. So Islam was the first religion that sort of openly demolished this, in my mind, illogical concept of a human being, right, being God. And that won me over right away because I thought, oh, this makes absolutely perfect sense. I mean, every Easter we have to watch God get beat up and a hole punched through his hand, right? He could not have been God, but all you know is all you know, right? So when I came across this religion, it openly said, God says the heavens and earth would rent asunder before, the creator of the universe became
a human being denigrated like that.
Right. So to me, I'm like, that makes perfect sense. So to me, the oneness of God was the most amazing. The second thing, which kind of goes hand in hand with the first, right, is that God not only still speaks, but he has dictated a book, right? And the book is God's speech from start to finish, right? And so for me, that was mind-blowing. That was phenomenal. This is God in the first hand speaking.
First person, yeah.
Right? First person. This, from Bismillah.
And just for clarity for the audience, it's called the Quran, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
we're speaking of the Quran. So for me, this book, the Holy Quran that God dictated, right, was absolutely phenomenal. Now, the proof then becomes, what did God say?
Yeah.
Right? And in that study of the Quran, I just found it fascinating, particularly at that time. I found components of the Quran that made reference to scientific phenomena.
Okay.
And that, for me, was absolutely amazing. That gave me such a sense of confidence because the book had also mentioned that, just to paraphrase, verily, we have revealed this book and we will be its protector. So for me, having that assurance in the book itself, saying that God had revealed this book and that he would in fact protect it against interpolation or being changed. And at the same time, the same book is making reference to scientific phenomena that weren't discovered for hundreds or even 1,000 years after the book was revealed. For me, I thought, yep, this is the direction that I want to go in. I already believe that there is a God, but now I have confirmation that he can't be any living thing, right? Any material thing whatsoever, right? Because the universe is just way too vast and too perfect for some human on some planet in some solar system in some galaxy to be ruling over the other bits. Especially if we watch every Easter him get beat up in a hole, punched in his hand, and these sorts of things. Whether it's trees or human beings, we know God can't be anything like that. So this was the first religion I had come across that really drove that point home to my satisfaction as well. So for me, it was like, this is the religion for me.
And then it was the question, does God speak?
Oh, absolutely. The proof that it has happened to another person was enough for me.
Okay, so where did you go from there? So you were convinced of the truth of Islam, you accepted it formally, right? What was the kind of effect that had upon your life?
Well, it had no effect at first.
Okay.
Right? So when I first embraced Islam, I accepted it from a theoretical point of view.
Okay, fine.
Right? And this is why I say, well, if someone else has spoken to God, in this particular case, the founder of Islam, the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him, if it happened to him and God has dictated this book to him and he has produced that book, for me, that was evidence that God still exists, still speaks. And I was satisfied with that. Okay. Right? So then as I continued my research and debates throughout the Bronx, right, there was probably a satisfaction and a working effort to ensure that I had, in fact, embraced the right faith.
Okay.
So in other words...
So you want some proof. You want something in your hand.
I wanted to test its arguments against people who combated those arguments or didn't believe in the faith.
Sure.
So the debate served that purpose for me as well.
Okay.
So that I could rule out any lingering bits. So in the interim, my life didn't change at all. It didn't change at all. I was still the same. So my day-to-day life, that spiritual purification did not happen. At this point, everything is academic.
Okay.
So I had gotten to a point where I think I asked one particular gentleman I was working with at the bank at that time, and I asked him some question. He says, "Oh, I don't know, but there's another brother that I know, and he may be able to answer it for you. Look him up in because he also worked for our firm.
I see.
Look him up in our intranet." So I looked this guy up in intranet, gave him a call. He called me back the next day, and we started to hang out, right? And we didn't really talk about religious things. I probably can see that he probably thought, well, he's already doing his religious journey, right? But what was interesting is that he wanted to get to know me as a person, which I found interesting. So there was no preaching to me.
No pressure.
No pressure or anything like that. He invited me down to the mosque to meet some of the other people there. And I remember meeting with the Imam there, whose name is Imam Inam al-Kosar. And this was around the month of Ramadan. And we went to his house, and while we were at his house, he had a house right next to the mosque. And while we were at his house, I recall him starting the subject of people who've had spiritual experiences, dreams and visions, and different Ahmadi Muslims from all over the world.
So this was an Ahmadi mosque?
This was an Ahmadi mosque.
And you didn't know the differences and all that?
No.
This was just a mosque for you?
Exactly, and that's why I'm relating this to you, because at the time, the gentleman that worked at my firm, he turned out to be an Ahmadi. And the person that he mentioned, you should call him, also turned out to be an Ahmadi. Okay. And this brother invited me down to the mosque, and it turned out to be an Ahmadi mosque. But my point is that none of them had preached to me, so to speak.
Yeah.
They just treated me like I was a person.
A friend.
I believed myself to be a Muslim, and they treated me like a friend. You know, and we were all just Muslims.
Yeah.
You know, and I wasn't practicing as a Muslim, but I believed myself to be a Muslim. I believed that God was one, and I believed that Muhammad, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, was his prophet. And I believe that these people who invited me here down believed the same. I could see that they believed the same, but I could see that they were actually practicing Islam. So I went down there, and I remember sitting in this Imam's house, Imam Inam al-Kosar, and they started to talk about the various different spiritual experiences that different Ahmadis around the world had had. And I was absolutely amazed to hear these things. I mean, I had my own share of stories that I have seen and heard with my grandmother, who, as I mentioned, was a Christian, and other family members who were also Christian. But I had never seen that type of quality and quantity.
Objectivity to it, or kind of reality to it.
No, I think there was also a bit of reality to it in what I'd seen with my grandmother and also other family members who were religious minded. But I had never seen that degree of quality, the clarity of these visions and dreams and even revelation. I'd never seen anything that crisp and clear. And for someone to be able to rattle off the top of their head, countless other Ahmadi Muslims who had seen that. I mean, I was just absolutely blown away. Anyway, when I went home that night, I started to then think to myself, well, I know then that God is real and that he still exists and he still talks. Of that, I believe a great degree. But now the personal question had come about. Well, this isn't happening to me, right? And when I examined myself, I realized that my life hadn't really changed, right? So I believed in Allah and his messenger. I believed in the founders of all other religions. I believed in the Quran. But I still wasn't consistently making prayers, right? I hadn't stopped several habits that I had. And I thought to myself, I've been running around here debating all of these different people, whether they're religious or non-religious, but the quality of my own life hasn't changed, number one. And number two is, I'm not even satisfied that I'm getting the actual fruit of becoming a so-called religious or spiritual person.
Okay.
So my mind suggested to me, well, maybe it has something to do with these people. Maybe there's some flaw. Maybe they're exaggerating or this, that, and the third. And my heart had trouble with that. Because in my travels, visiting different mosques and meeting different Muslims for quite some time, they had a specific quality that I had never seen in any of the other mosques and among the other Muslims.
What was that?
There was a sincere brotherhood and affection amongst them.
Okay.
Right? Number one. Number two is the degree of their prayers was rich. It had no affectation to it. It had no, as far as I could tell, there was a degree of absorption in their prayers.
This is in the Ahmadi Mosque.
In the Ahmadi Mosque. There was a degree of absorption in their prayers and a humility about them. And most importantly, a fraternal love amongst them. A cohesive sort of spirit that I noticed that I had never seen in any other mosque. I mean, I've been to some mosques that were fraternal, were friendly. I've been to, mosques even where fights broke out during Jummah. And I'm talking about by the imam leading the Jummah, unfortunately.
Oh dear.
So I mean, I thought I saw sort of the gamut, the spectrum there, from the least ideal to the ideal. But there was something different, something spiritual about the fraternal engagement there that I saw. So this is, and when you put on top of that all of these stories, this is, this person's dream, this person's revelation. And, I went back home and I thought to myself, well, I want that.
Yeah.
Number one.
Who wouldn't?
And number two is, what are my realistic chances of successfully being able to achieve that? Now, of course, this is all by God's grace. It's God who himself is the end of all ends. And it's God himself who's looking to establish this relationship with an individual. So it's for God to decide when and where and how to communicate with anyone. Yeah, and no human being can
dictate to God.
Dictate to God, right? That's just an exercise in futility, right? So anyway, my mind suggested to me that, well, maybe these people aren't true though, because now that I think about it, these people claim that their founder is the Messiah.
Yeah.
Right. So this is where my mind took me. And I thought, well, that's a big claim. Right. And there's a certain safety in being the part of the so-called majority.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you'd like to think to yourself, well, we're all Sunnis here, but we're not all Sunnis here because our concept of the traditions of the Prophet will differ group by group, individual by individual.
Deobandi, Salafi,
Exactly.
Wahhabi,
They're broken
whatever.
into God knows how many sects, right? For me, I remember walking away and thinking to myself, well, I mean, like the majority of Muslims regard these people as disbelievers, kafir. And there's a certain safety in that, right? And I thought to myself, the problem I have with that is that I've been using these arguments.
Oh, you've been using the Ahmadi arguments against the Christians and
against anyone who disagreed, right?
And so you've been using the literature of the
literature. So I was very familiar with the literature, but I thought to myself, the problem I have is that this is a big claim. He's claimed to be the Messiah. Like, how many generations? My grandmother have lived and died waiting for this Messiah, right? So he claims to be the Messiah on the one hand, but on the other hand, this is a fantastic claim. This is an outrageous claim. It's crazy, but I can't deny the fact that his claims were absolutely solid enough so that no one could ever refute them. I had used them myself countless times, right? So I thought, well, how could a liar be so on point in his knowledge of the Quran and of the Hadith of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? I mean, it's not possible that if this is what the liars are like.
Show me the truthful one.
How on earth are we supposed to recognize the truthful people?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So I thought, the weakness has to be in me. Either this man is a complete and utter fraud, unlike the world has ever seen, beyond which there is no truthful person. Right? Because if this man is the imposter, and by the way, we have to keep in mind, this is what the Holy Prophet was called. So many other prophets before them, they were all called magicians and imposters. If this man is now followed in their footsteps, right, then you cannot distinguish between the truthful people, right, and the imposters.
Yeah.
But either way, or it just simply means that maybe I've got a weakness in me. Maybe there's something I haven't yet understood, right? So I remember walking down the street, and I remember it's like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I remember looking up at like a clear starless night. And I said, God, if this man is an imposter, save me from him.
Mirza Ghulam Ahmad.
Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian.
The founder of the Ahmadiyya community.
Absolutely. If he is an imposter, save me from him. Because I can't make heads or tails. His writings, his teachings are crystal clear. They're diamond rough. You know what I mean? How can you discern who is the truthful person if this person, such a sparkling personality with rock solid teachings, is false? So save me if this man is an imposter. But God, if this man is true, help me understand, but don't let me be a hypocrite. This was my prayer. My informal walking down the street.
What did you mean by? Do you mean like because I'm using his arguments but denying him?
Absolutely.
Don't let me be a hypocrite.
Yeah, I don't want to be. The thing is in my life up to that point, I had enough of being on both sides of the story. Right?
Yeah.
You believe in God on the one hand, but you live your life the way that you want. But the reality is, then you have to die. Now, if there is a God. And if there is a so-called heaven and hell, then there's a criteria to get in one or the other. And I can't rely on whatever imagination I have as a boarding pass into heaven. So it won't be a criterion based upon my own construction, right? There must be some separate criterion as to what one must achieve in order to get there.
Yeah.
Right? But more important than that to me was I wanted a relationship with God.
Yeah.
And a relationship with anyone entails them being happy with you or not. So I wanted a relationship, and naturally you want God to be happy with you, but that communication then becomes key. And that's what I wanted. So I thought to myself, if this man is actually an imposter, I can't be bothered. I don't want to be sucked into that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, his teachings look rock solid to me, and I have yet to find one person who can honestly refute them. You find a lot of foul-mouthed people just running around there saying nonsense. But I mean from a purely academic sense, from a person who has decent intelligence, right, and a good nature, it's just impossible
to refute these arguments.
To refute them, you just can't, right? But either way, I didn't want to be on both sides of the fence. On the one hand, you're running around with his arguments and this, that, and the third. On the other hand, you're like, oh, I don't believe him. He's write good books though. I don't want to be that guy. What's the point?
Yeah.
Either he's truthful or he's not.
Yeah.
So if he's not, let's move on.
Yeah.
If he is, then we have to accept him, because if what he says is true, it will surely come to pass.
Yes.
Right? So this is what, oh God, if he's false, because this is a big claim, save me from him. But if he's true, help me understand. Now, in my mind, I thought maybe I need to study more, I need to read more, and this, that, and the third. Right? So I said, help me understand, but don't let me be a hypocrite. So anyway, I went home and I decided, you know what? I got to step my game up though, right? So I got to start making the prayers and this, that, and the third. And as I earlier mentioned, it was like 1 or so in the morning. So I thought, okay, I'll go ahead and I'll make the early morning prayer, the Fajr prayer. So I laid down on the couch, and I hadn't been on the couch for 5 seconds when like I felt like I was falling back, like falling into a deep, deep sleep. But before I could fall into this sleep, I saw a book held out in front of my face, and the pages were turning. And then this voice, like, I think I've explained this to you before. It's very difficult to describe, but it's like almost like the ringing of a bell, but in the form of like a plane when it's flying real low, or like a loud train. It was like thunder, but it was a voice, right? And it said, number 1, preach. There is none worthy of worship save Allah. Number 2, preach. There is none worthy of worship save Allah. And the strange thing is the voice sounded like it had an Indian accent, right? But this voice, that's just a mental note that I made while I was, right? But that was the least of my concerns at that time, because this voice was like...
It kept repeating that?
And it just kept repeating it.
Number 1, number 2,
number 1, number 2, number 1, number 2, right? And but the voice was so... it was so powerful, right? It was like the voice itself had you in its grip.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was like, it's very difficult to describe, but it's like the sound of the voice itself just enveloped you.
So it wasn't an auditory voice, it was a voice you held.
This wasn't James Earl Jones, brother. This was, whatever it was, the voice itself was everything.
Yes, I understand. So it was a voice you heard with your soul.
You heard it with every particle of your being. I can't say I heard it with my ears or I heard it in my heart. The voice was everything. The voice was everything. Like if someone pushed you into a pool and you slowly started to sink down at the bottom of the pool, the voice was the water around you. And every ripple, every wave that moves through that pool also affects you.
Yeah.
This was that voice.
So in a way, this was a kind of proof in your hand that, one, they were talking truth. And secondly, there's an implicit message in there, isn't there? Which is that the purpose, you're being commanded, number 1, the most important thing is to preach the unity of Allah.
Right.
Right? The God is one. And the number 2 is the same thing.
Yeah.
So in a way, what did you take from that?
At the time, I was just hoping I was going to survive.
Oh, you thought you were...
I thought I was going to die. This
really?
voice was this is what I'm trying to convey to you in terms of the intensity of this, right? What you're talking about was food for thought for later as I reflected on this experience. At that time, I was wondering if I was going to survive this. And it just kept repeating and repeating and repeating. So anyway, I don't know how long it went on, but I know it ended at 3:14 a.m. because as it slowly began to fade away, if you want to call it, I remember just lying there on the couch with my eyes closed, and because I wasn't sure if somebody was in the room with me. I mean, because I was just completely frozen in fear, right? So I remember when I opened up my eyes, I remember looking around the room, and I turned and looked at, we had one of the old school alarm clocks with the numbers in red block letters, right? Yeah. And I remember it said 3:14, right? And I just jumped up and started crying hysterically. I went to my wife and told her what happened. I could tell by the look in her eyes, she was thinking to herself, this dude and lost it. He's completely lost it, right? And when I sensed that, I realized, okay, let me cool off. So I went back into the living room and I called 3 people, and the third person picked up the phone. Again, this is like 3-something in the morning. And the third person was Imam Inam al-Haq Khoser.
From the Ahmadi community.
Yes. And he picked up the phone, and I started going on. I'm blubbering, oh, Imam Zah, and I tell him what happened to me. And I remember how absolutely nonplussed he was. You know, he was just like, is this good? No, but you've got to understand. And I think, you know, and I tried to explain it to him like 3 or 4 times. He's like, this is good. This is the kalama shahada, right? The affirmation of God's oneness.
Yeah.
And finally, I think around the 3rd or 4th time, he says, Hamza Ilyas Sahib, Hamza, you need to get some rest. I'm sure you're tired. So I put down the phone, and I didn't sleep, I don't think, that night. But now, fast forwarding to your earlier comments, looking back, absolutely, the oneness of God is the most important thing. But one of the reasons why I emphasized how it felt, right, is because I want to impress upon you, for a person who was thinking to themselves, I'm not sure if this person is true, right? And writes good books though. You know what I mean? After that experience, there was not a doubt in my mind as to, number one, it's one thing to believe in God, but when God communicates with you, this is also a means to strengthening your iman, your faith.
Yes.
And as to affirm and deliver to you with certainty that God certainly exists. And I say that because me and a lot of people like me, we grow up, you know, kind of like, no, we do believe that there's a God, but like he leaves you to do it, to do what you want.
Yeah.
You do what you like. Yeah. You know what I mean? Now, implicit in that is a bit of doubt as to whether or not God either exists, or whether or not you're going to be held accountable for whatever it is that you're doing.
This is what the Promised Messiah writes. It says most people, even if they say they believe in God, they believe in him in a formulaic manner. And even if they believe in him, they're not really sure whether God is going to hold them accountable. And even if he is going to hold them accountable, they're not even sure if he knows everything they're doing. You know, it's
exactly.
this kind of
There's this whole
wishy-washy
gray area that happens in your belief that, you know, this is where I was at.
Yeah.
Right? So it was like...
So God pulled you and thrust you into certainty.
I mean, this is the beauty of witnessing God in the various forms that you find in the world. You know, God communicating, reaching out, and you know that certainty, right?
So how did that convince you of the truth? I can see how that convinced you of the truth of God speaking and brought it really alive for you. How did it convince you of the truth of the promised Messiah, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad?
A few weeks before that, I had seen in another dream where I walked into a room, and I think I told you about this dream before, but where I had walked into a room and there were 2 men with white turbans, but one was slightly taller. And the voice said, "This is Prophet Muhammad." And the taller one came over to me and put these coins into my pocket, right? So later on, the second shorter man, I ended up seeing that man's picture in the Ahmadi mosque. So for me...
And who was that?
Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian, alayhi salatu wasalam.
So you saw the photo of the promised Messiah before you ever saw him in a photo, you saw him in your dream.
Exactly.
And when you saw the photo, you recognized this is the man I saw in my dream.
Exactly.
So that's extraordinary because you can't imagine somebody you've never seen.
Yeah, that's true too. But again, it's, you know, in those early stages of Islam, it didn't, because I didn't place much weight in dreams. So it was just like, right? When I went to go visit the mosque, and I was like, oh, what's that? They were like, oh, that's the promised Messiah. Again, they weren't really preaching to me or anything. They just mentioned it casually. And so I was just like, oh, that's weird. But this whole phenomena of dreams and this sort of thing was relatively new for me in terms of giving them any type of weight. So in my mind, I saw it as a coincidence. That's interesting. But it wasn't something that I was going to run with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
So that was probably one of the early major experiences that I had. The second one, which is the most, in my experience, the second one and the most major experience was
the one
the
you
preach,
described.
right? The one that I just got finished talking about. Preach, there's none worthy of worship save Allah. So for me, when I looked back at those and I combined them, for me, that was a collective proof, right? So in the first one, it had the two individuals there, the Holy Prophet ﷺ and the promised Messiah, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. And the second one saying, preach, there's none worthy of worship save Allah, but it had that slight Indian accent. For me, when I viewed those collectively, it was like, yeah, this is true. And it's just the way that I processed it.
And in a way, it is a very interesting message in that. Number one, preach that there is none worthy of worship save Allah. Number two, preach that there is none worthy of worship save Allah, which is that you'd been using the writings of the promised Messiah to demonstrate the unity of God to people of other faiths. And so in a way, the criterion it was giving you was that the one who is from God, his foremost role is to demonstrate the unity of God.
Of God.
And you had already had the proof of his truth, therefore, in your hand when you were using his arguments for the unity of God. In other words, the Prophet Muhammad, who was number one, preached the unity of God, and number two, his representative in this age also preaches the unity of God. To wrap up, I understand, that was 2004, it's 2021, a lot has happened since then, I'm sure. Have such experiences stopped? Do you find that when you entered the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and you're an old-timer, as they say, okay, you're not a newbie,
right.
Have you found what Imam al-Haq Qasr, what he said about, this person's had this experience, this person's had this experience, was that an example of Asiatic exaggeration, or was it an example of absolute truth? And as you've entered into the Ahmadiyya community, have you recognized more such experiences in yourself and in other Ahmadi Muslims that you have met over the last nearly 20 years now?
Definitely. I mean, obviously...
Because we can't go through all of them here, we don't have time for it, but I just want to get a sense from you.
Of course. No. You've hit it right on the head. There's not too much to add. I mean, it's been 20 plus years. Obviously, I myself became one of the examples of, in some way, shape, or form, of a story that Imam al-Qasr is probably telling to this day. So there's no...
Probably right now.
But, I myself became one of those examples. So in my own experience, just countless Ahmadis around the world, some more phenomenal, experiences than mine. I mean, mine pales in comparison. And then you meet folks who not only that is the quality greater, but they get them in far greater quantities as well. So it's been my personal experience. Yes, I've had these types of experiences to a greater or lesser degree continue in the nearly 20 years, and I've met so many Ahmadis around the world who have experiences that are much more plentiful and much more clarity.
And in a way, that's a good point to wrap up on, because all Muslims will know the Surah Fatiha. In the central portion of Surah Fatiha is Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, Sirat al-Ladhina an'amta alayhim. Guide us upon the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your blessings. And in a way, we see those blessings in the Ahmadiyya Muslim community at all levels, and this is only one aspect of those blessings, which is of personal certainty given to an individual through spiritual experiences from God.
But having said that, I think the most important thing that I've taken out of it in this nearly 20 years is that those experiences only mean something if they improve your personal quality, the quality of your your worship, of your prayers. Without that experience improving the quality of your worship, essentially just making you a better human being, if those experiences don't do that, then they mean nothing.
Yeah. Of course, that's absolutely correct, because the purpose of life is to ultimately attain God's nearness and to follow the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
And these experiences increase your certainty of God's existence, and also improve or help you to continue to strive to improve the quality of your relationship with God. So it follows that if one is trying to improve the quality of their relationship with God, they must continue to strive to be a better person, which means being a better human being to the other human beings you live with as well. So if these experiences aren't making you a better person, aren't improving the quality of life for others around you, then they're a waste.
And they're a means of holding you to account. On that sober note, after a very enjoyable and pleasant chat, we'll end it there. Please do subscribe to the channel and please do tune in to future videos. Hit the like button, leave a comment for Brother Hamza and myself to read later, and we will catch you with the next video. Peace be on you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.